I forgot my name tag, so you're going to have to believe that I'm the right person. Let me begin this talk this year, as I began my talk in Salida 2 years ago, by thanking Kathy for inviting me and for her friendship, and by thanking Kent's daughters and family. This time I get to see Mark Sprague, who wasn't able to make it 2 years ago, and meet Peter Brown and others. The talks yesterday raised the bar so high that I just can't hope to reach it today. I will say, Mark has visited my campus in Greencastle several times. He's spoken to my students. And his essay, A Boy's Work, From Where Rivers Change Direction, is, in my opinion, the best piece of nonfiction narrative put to paper. And so, and I show it to my students, and then when I was lucky enough to have Mark visit my class, I think a senior seminar one year, he sat and talked to those 15 students, and the advice he gave them, of course he was talking to them, he was talking to me at the same time, but that was probably, I don't know, Mark, 10 years ago or so, but it resonates with me. And so much of what he said is true. One thing, I'll give you one example. He said, if you feel the need to end a piece of writing with a chunk of exposition, then the scenes within that piece haven't done their job. Trust the scenes, he said. And this has just become some of the same sermon that I preach. So anyway, I wanted to give him a shout out. So for me personally, this event has become a highlight of my year. This year my wife Alyssa was able to come. Last year my parents were here. My mom, if you met her 2 years ago, was so short of breath. And we found out as soon as she flew back home to Indiana that she had blood clots. And so you're not supposed to fly with blood clots or be at high altitude. But you know what? She was not going to miss this event. And now she's fine. So I think Kevin would have said, "God damn, woman, you got to go to the doctor." But she didn't. So anyway, I want to thank our organizers one more time for doing such a great job. This is such a great event. I'm so happy to be here. It's hard to leave Indiana in the fall, which does have its beauties, to fly out to Colorado at this time of year. Hard work, this life, but someone has to do it. So my title is long, How Haruf Teaches a Place, What a Writer Can Learn About Setting from Haruf Novels, and What One Writer Learned from the Man Himself. But it has already worked for me. This past summer, an international group of attorneys held their annual conference in Colorado, the ALAS group. And the group's big enough that it has a 100-member book club. This year they read Plain Song because they were going to be in Colorado. The group's organizers saw my title online and invited me to come talk to the book club. They put us up at the Broadmoor Resort in Colorado Springs for 3 nights. As I said there, I grew up on a beef and row crop farm in southern Indiana, so I'm used to staying in nicer places than this, but it did work. So, yeah, hard life. Kent's mentorship of me has paid dividends to me in untold ways, and he's still helping me today. My talk at the Broadmoor included slides, and that proved to me to be too much emotionally. I spoke for over an hour at times, just quietly sobbing. It was no doubt hard to watch. I don't expect a repeat performance today, but you never know. Another possible title for this weekend celebration might be Watching Adults Cry at Podiums or WCAP. That's for your consideration, Kat. Today's talk is a touch more formal, but I won't let it get too stuffy in here. After all, I'm a writing prof, not a literature professor. No offense to him, although of course there's a colon in my title today. I won't take us too far into the weeds of literary theory. There's a difference between writing and literature professors, you know. I, like Kent did, teach creative writing. Kent and I hold the MFA degree, the Master of Fine Arts, not the PhD of a literature professor. You might have gotten a literature professor in here today to break down Kent's writing in intricate and detailed ways, and you could deconstruct it until the cows come home. I would rather do less of that. I'd rather talk about the magic of his books and more precisely, the magic of what he's doing with place and setting in his works. So I'm not a Haruf scholar, I'm a Haruf friend. There's probably a difference, or a Haruf groupie. I was lucky enough to share a stage with Kent several times in my life. I once heard him read at nearby Castle Rock, and I know what he would say if he was standing here right now because he had a signature line that he said anytime he took to the podium, "It's good to be here. It's good to be anywhere." I'm going to do my best to bring in some of his spirit in here today because he would have loved to look out and see all of you wonderful people here. He delighted in sharing his work with readers, even though he didn't go into the business with such designs, but it became one of the great joys of his life. He told me once, you can never write a book for anyone else. You have to write it for yourself. And he certainly didn't write for monetary reward or reviews. His act of writing was solitary and done for private reasons, I think, but he wrote to ultimately share his work, and he cherished his readers. I'm going to give you the first insight I have about Kent's writing. While taking fiction writing workshops from Kent as a graduate student, my peers and I had questions, of course, about plot and structure, but we also had questions about sentences. Kent told us once, you can get so worried about writing and editing the perfect sentence that you get stymied and never write a thing. Here's what he had done to remedy this. While writing Plainsong, and he didn't tell us what he was working on, we just knew he was trying to write another novel, Kent would go into his former coal room in the basement of his modest home in Murfreesboro, Illinois. And when I went to that house for his wedding to Kathy, he showed me this coal cellar. That's where he would write. He had a simple desk, a manual typewriter, and a bull skull fastened to the wall over the desk. A map of the high plains of Colorado also hung on the wall. It was cold down there, so in the winter he'd wear a stocking cap, Denver Broncos orange. Peter Brown touched on this yesterday. Well, to keep himself from rereading and editing those sentences he was banging out on that manual typewriter, he began pulling that Broncos cap over his eyes. Eventually he grew to love the blindness, the fact that he could not see what he was writing. He could feel the keys, and so he wrote on each day blindly. But he didn't let himself get stopped thinking that a sentence wasn't good enough. He wrote a scene, a chapter a day. Later he would edit those sentences, and he was a stickler for language, of course. Those sentences sing, and you don't get that by accident. But in the first draft, he wanted to get the story down, and he wanted to keep moving. Now, I will offer this teaser. My wife and I read Plainsong in manuscript form when it was an untitled stack of loose pages in a box, and I made a suggestion that Kent implemented that changed the whole scene. If you remember, you can ask me about it during the Q&A. But think for a second about those images, artifacts, or talismans in Kent's coal room. A map, a skull, complete with sand sprinkling out of it. Those are items connected to place. I work in Greencastle, Indiana now as a professor at DePauw University, which is a small private liberal arts college. But I first met Kent in the fall of '95 when I enrolled in Southern Illinois University at Carbondale as a graduate student. But what really surprised me is that when I met Kent, it quickly became clear that he knew my work even if I didn't know his. In my portfolio I had submitted with my application, I had a piece of fiction where a character goes carp fishing. I was really into carp fishing for a while. When I first met Kent, he told me he admired that section. What he told me later, once I really got to know him, is that he was really the only faculty member to argue for my admittance. And it was because of that carp fishing scene. See, what we've learned from reading Plainsong and other books is that Kent values place, and in particular rural places. What he saw in my work, if nothing else, was someone else who valued place. I was coming from a grain and cattle farm in southeastern Indiana, and I think Kent liked the idea of that, so he talked his colleagues into accepting me. I suppose you might be ready for a joke. It's just about my only joke, and it's sort of a parlor trick. I use it in my own classrooms. Let me ask you now, what are the 3 C's of storytelling? Now, normally I would call on students who had their hands up. But usually, pretty quickly, someone will say characters. So I write that on the board. And then some of them will guess, they'll say conclusion, I'll say it's got to have a conclusion, so on and so forth. Someone will usually say conflict, though, pretty quickly. And so I say, okay, we've got character and conflict. Every story, I don't care if it's a joke, I don't care if it's a movie, short story, novel, it has a character or characters and some sort of conflict to drive those characters. So what's the 3rd C? Well, they guess and guess, and then eventually I write the word setting with a C on the board, and I say, it's a soft C. Because the truth is, nobody wants to remember the 2 C's and 1 S. But it's hard to tell a story without these 3 things. But many storytellers treat the items in that order. Get your characters down, add a conflict, and place them all in a town somewhere later. Or more likely, include so little in terms of setting that the story could literally take place anywhere or nowhere. Setting can become merely an afterthought, characters in a vacuum. But the truth is, any one of these 3 levers can change an entire story. Start with a conflict this time, an unexpected pregnancy. My college students always want to write about unexpected pregnancies. Let's say a 15-year-old girl and a 16-year-old boy. Setting, a tiny town in rural Indiana, population 986. 20 miles from the nearest interstate, which is nothing more than a long stretch of extension cord when you get to it. Now pull the character level. Still an unexpected pregnancy. 50-year-old college professor of sociology and the man hired to paint her academic building. Both of them married to other people. Setting, a small city in rural Indiana, 10 miles from our previous setting. Same basic premise of a conflict, different characters, and isn't this a totally different story? But what if we made that story take place in Manhattan or Denver? Surely we all would agree that the setting makes the characters who they are and also drives or alters the conflict. A pregnant girl in rural Indiana might never conceive of an abortion plan. The nearest clinic might be over 100 miles away, and the mystery of it could be confounded. A girl in a big city might be minutes from one, and that might change her thinking. Or not. The point is, setting greatly influences character choices and options, or it should. Eudora Welty once claimed that too many fiction writers treat setting as a, quote, lesser angel, and encouraged writers to pay more mind to a story's setting. Her story, A Worn Path, as the title implies, is strongly driven by setting. Now, of course, the writer has to know the setting well enough to make this place real for the reader. I can't write the High Plains, for example. Recall in Plain Song when Maggie Jones tells Victoria Rubidoux she needs to go see a doctor. Victoria says, "But Mrs. Jones, isn't there a woman doctor I could go to?" Maggie answers, "Not here, not in Holt." Victoria says, "Maybe I could go to another town." To this, Maggie says simply, "Honey, listen to me. You are here now. This is where you are." That's Kent making his characters react to their setting, their environment, Holt in this case, its blessings and curses. And I don't think anyone here would doubt that Kent knew Holt. But setting is not just a town or a city. Writers also need to create atmosphere. They need to make the physical world of the story so tangible, readers feel like they can touch it. And one could do worse than study Kent for tips on how to do this. After the Murphy kid in Plain Song, I don't think he ever gets a first name, gives his uninspired speech about Thomas Jefferson in Guthrie's class, the teacher makes the dumb boy sit down. Then watch what Kent does. The big boy handed over the single sheet of tablet paper and stomped back and sat down. Guthrie watched him. The boy had sold up now. He was staring straight ahead. The room was quiet, the students all waiting and watching him. He looked away and stared out the window. The trees along the curb in front of the school still showed sunlight at the tops. In the slanting afternoon sun, the trees cast the thinnest of shadows as though they had been sprayed onto the street and the brown grass. For weeks it had been very dry, and in the nights there were hard freezes. He turned back and called Victoria Rubidoux to make her speech. So that's an example of how to build atmosphere or mood along with setting. The reader is forced to look out the window just as Guthrie does. Readers hear the sound of Murphy's boots and then the following awkward silence. Most of the senses are evoked. As a result, the readers feel as trapped and forlorn as everyone else. When one of my students does a particularly good job of capturing high school life, I always write something in my critique like this: "You've done a great job of creating the high school setting. Readers feel like they're back in high school. Thanks a lot." I also tell my students to occasionally pause the narrative to as I say, pan the GoPro around. They usually understand this. They grew up watching YouTube videos filmed by handheld cameras like GoPros. What this means is that they should pause the action of the scene to briefly show us the world surrounding the characters. This is what Kent does in this classroom scene expertly. He does it on damn near every page he's written. Look at what he does in the abandoned house in Plainsong, the one where Ike and Bobby watch as Russ and the same Murphy kid take advantage of Charlene's devotion to Russ. That's a powerful scene, but the place becomes even more powerful when Ike and Bobby return with the little shithead Donnie Lee Burris. Ike and Bobby, that's my word for him, not Kent's. Ike and Bobby stop and look at the house. To them, this has become a sacred place. Hear how Kent describes the setting here. When they were in front of the empty house at the end of the road, they stopped to study it and everything around it. The broken down, neglected locust trees, shaggy bark, the overgrown yard, the dead sunflowers coming up everywhere with their heads loaded and drooping. Everything dry and brown now in the late fall, dust-coated, and the sunken house itself diminished and weathered, with the front door swung open carelessly and the windows broken out over the years, and the sole square window in the attic bearing a fly screen that was turned down loose from one corner in a way that looked peculiar, like it was sleepy-eyed. Donnie Lee Burris, right after that passage, asks the boys, "What are you waiting on now?" To which the boys reply, "Nothing, we're just looking at it." And so are the readers. Notice how Kent gives us spatial and temporal setting. It's late fall. Everything is dying or already dead. Not a hopeful time. Writers don't always think about the power of temporal setting. When does a scene or story occur? How does that affect the readers? Plainsong covers roughly 9 months, the time of Victoria Rubidoux' pregnancy, but it concludes in May, not December. It ends optimistically with summer stretched out before them. Tim O'Brien's story, Speaking of Courage, it's in his collection, Things They Carried. Speaking of Courage is about a Vietnam vet who has returned to his hometown after the war. It's not a happy homecoming. He, Norman Bowker, doesn't know how to talk about his experiences in the war, and the townspeople don't know how to ask about it. The spatial setting of that story has Bowker driving endless loops around the town lake, alone in his father's big Chevy. But when is it set? Independence Day. It concludes with fireworks over the lake. Now, Dead Winter might have been more desolate, making the sad story even sadder. But really, what's sadder than a country ignoring its heroes on the day when we are supposed to honor them? So it's set on the 4th of July. But here in this setting, this abandoned house, this would-be church, reveals something else about Ike and Bobby. They have become attached to Charlene, and maybe women in general, through this house, this now sacred place. Inside the house, when Donnie Lee Burris, quote, reached out and pulled one of the candle stubs from the throat of the beer bottle, the boys act like he has stolen something off the altar during Sunday Mass. "You leave them alone too," Ike said. Donnie Lee replies, "You don't own this place. It's just junk, old-time shit. What's wrong with taking something?" But of course, to Ike and Bobby, it all means something. It's a church or a museum. Of course, you can find examples of Kent using setting like this throughout every story he's written. He was a master of it. As students, we understood this was the first lesson Kent set out to teach us. Look at what he does with the teen John Wesley in the terribly sad scene near the end of Benediction. He, John Wesley, struck a match and smeared the charcoal end on his fingers. It made a black stain. He lighted a dozen more matches and set them in a dish. Then he began to blacken his face. When he was finished, he stood looking at himself in the cabinet mirror. All his face was dark now, and he shut the light off and dumped the match ends in the trash can and rinsed the dish and put it away and drank a glass of water at the sink and went out the door to the garage. There was a long, narrow driveway running alongside the house to the garage. Grass had grown up in the gravel. In the garage, he pulled the overhead door shut and locked it and locked the side door. Light filtered in from the small windows at the sides. From the rear of the garage, he brought out an old wood chair and set it in the middle of the floor where the fine dirt was black and shiny with oil leaks from the car. Then he brought out the wood box from under the workbench, On the bench were a steel vise and cans of nails and old hammers and wrenches, all coated with oily dust. He set the box on the chair. After that, he got out the cotton rope he bought at the hardware store on Main Street and hidden in the corner by the workbench. Now that's a lot of character development, but readers can also see how setting can build suspense. Ken takes his time to create this scene, this setting, and readers find themselves holding their breath as they read. This boy is going to die in the most mundane and common of locations, and he is alone. Creating a vivid, lifelike setting is about one word: details. I said earlier I asked students to pan the GoPro around, but it's just that, a quick panning. No need to describe every single thing in a setting. How could you? Describe every last item in that garage? It's impossible. Writers who do that sort of thing are tedious as hell to read, and they give setting a bad name. But it's important to choose the right details that stand in for all others. For example, once you see that, quote, fine black dirt that was shiny with oil leaks from the car, don't you know what kind of garage you're in? Who is better at selecting the key few details than Ken Haruf? There was no one better. But what can we learn from this technique? You learn that setting is a tool that a writer can use to develop and deepen characters, and a device that will escalate or advance plot. So it's not that setting is a lesser angel, as Eudora Welty warned us it could be, but a third leg on a three-legged stool. Crucial, necessary. And when it's done well, setting will do more to attach readers to your story than characters of conflict. Setting drives character and conflict. So I personally give this assignment. This is from a handout. For your next work of fiction, aim to make setting a key component of the story, one that deeply influences not only how your characters act, but the very core of their beings. Think about temporal setting, the time of the story, and the spatial setting, or the physical properties of place. To get you thinking about this, I want you to write a nonfiction piece about a particular place. Describe this area as fully and as deeply as you can. In addition, I want you to capture the effect of this place on its people. So maybe describe a town and what the locals are like. Or you could get more specific. Write about a particular mall, say, and the kinds of customers it attracts. Think about time, too. Are you describing the town in the depths of a Minnesotan winter? The mall right after 9/11? Rockville, Indiana during the Covered Bridge Festival? You could get even more specific. Are you haunted by a certain house? Enchanted by a bend in a distinct creek? Held captive by a stretch of seashore? Mesmerized by the memories of your grandfather's woodshop? Note, the larger the place, the harder the piece becomes to write, and the harder the subsequent story becomes to write. Take on New York City, say, or Indiana, and the amount of range of material makes the piece unwieldy. But right now, write a nonfiction piece that captures the spirit of a place. Physical description will be important, so find the right place details. You've earned the details after all. That's something I talk to my students about, earning the details. Be efficient, accurate, and interesting in your portrayal. You'll also want to render the right tone and mood, which is atmosphere. You may or may not be able to include dialogue. Most importantly, keep asking yourself, why am I drawn to this place? Start thinking about how place and time affect characters, and you for that matter. For your next short story or novel, try writing fiction strongly driven by this setting. So anyway, that's a handout. Students aren't always happy to get handouts, but they usually have a good time writing that exercise. After graduate school, once I started teaching, I finally finished a novel, mostly because of that great Kent quote. You have to believe in yourself despite the evidence. I felt as though I had a little flame of talent, not a big talent, but a little pilot light-sized flame of talent, and I had to tend to it regularly, religiously, with care and discipline, like a kind of monk or acolyte, and to never let that little flame go out. This next part's pretty self-indulgent. I had a young lady at the front desk print this talk for me, and she said, it printed so that every other page is upside down. Will that bother you? I said, I'm a damn pro. No, I'm just about lost. My wife was like, that's not going to work. Well, what I just read is what Kent said about himself, but he told me the same thing. So I got an independent press in Denver to publish my novel, and Kent offered to introduce me at the tattered cover. So I read there, and they made a podcast of it, complete with Kent's introduction, which of course the only reason anyone showed up, right, at the tattered cover. They knew Kent was going to be there. I introduced Kent at DePauw, where I teach, when he read there 2 different times. About my own novel, I will always say this. It was influenced, of course, by Kent. How could it not be? And I had written 600 double-spaced pages before anyone, even my wife, had read a word of it. Kent was one of the very first to read it. It's about an Indiana farming family, an elderly couple and their estranged son, dealing with eminent domain and the impending loss of their land. They have a river-bottom farm, and the government's going to flood their land to build a reservoir. In the book, I wanted to show that this flooding does, in fact, happen. Usually when they build those reservoirs, it takes, 3, 4, 5 years. And I wanted to show that, so I have this short postlude at the end of the novel that reveals life after the dam. Kent read this and made a suggestion. He said, write a short lyric page or 2, he said. I want you to show this water rising. What was he asking for? Setting. He wanted me to show a place and the very process of shifting to something completely different. If you'll indulge me, I'll read it. It's 4 paragraphs long. It rose through the trees as surely and as steadily as tomato plants growing in June. First it surrounded the trunks of the sycamores, then it came farther and slipped over the roots of the oaks and maples. They were merely stumps by then, and within weeks all the stumps were gone, their flat tops like so many kitchen tables submerged. It crept through the fescue and the sagging wire fence. The garden, long since returned to a rectangular patch of weeds, was overtaken slowly from west to east. It lapped at the stone foundation of the barn before crawling up the frame, the hand-hewn timbers as seasoned and hard as iron. By the time it reached the floor of the loft, it was touching the bottom step at the back of the house. Looters had kicked the door in, and the water flowed over the threshold and across the floor. The dirty river water climbed the steps to their bedroom. It covered everything until the only remaining mark of their existence was the peak of the barn roof. The water swirled around it, the upturned keel of a ship sinking, and then the barn roof too was hidden. So that's from my book, and Kent didn't tell me what to write, of course, but he told me to write something there. And I think you can hear echoes of Kent in that short excerpt. So what can I say? He taught me for 3 years in the classroom and informally for many years beyond that. His books, his writing continues to teach us all if we read it carefully. I would be happy to take any questions you have. Ken and I used to laugh. My younger brother, I told my younger brother I was writing a book, and he said, nobody wants to read that shit. So Ken and I always joked about that sort of podium, just the idea of somebody being at the podium. So I had what felt like too damn much, but I got through it efficiently, perhaps. So I would be happy to take any questions about anything. I've kept my eyes dry, but I will say, if anyone wants to hear it, I also have the list of 14 hopes for fiction writing students that Kent gives every class, and that was, I think, a big moment for people to hear that 2 years ago, and I just happened to bring it. That's kind of a teaser now. Yeah, it's like I'm going to talk that much about it. So when you were in a Kent Haruf class, and Peter and Mark, everyone's talking about the seriousness that Kent approached writing and the act of writing with. And he told me one time I was a graduate student, but he also taught some undergraduate classes, and he told me once that they weren't taking the class seriously. And he said, I'm going to have to go in there and straighten them up. And what he went in there and told them was, look, this is my religion. This is what I take more seriously than anything else, and a lot of you are coming in here and pissing on my altar. And so, Peter and I were just talking right this morning, and he said, there's kind of an idea that Kent was a saint, And he was, but he was also funny, and he was also not afraid to be harsh or critical of a student when he needed to be. But he opened every fiction writing class with this list of 14 things. Number 1, I hope that you read fiction daily. Number 2, I hope that you're crazy about it, that you crave it, that you're addicted to it. 3, I hope that given the choice you would rather choose to read a story by Peter Taylor or Flannery O'Connor or Toni Morrison or William Faulkner or Anton Chekhov rather than eat shrimp linguine or drink Heineken's beer or engage even in sex. Number 4, I hope that unless you've read some fiction sometime during the day that you can't sleep at night because your day has been incomplete and unsatisfying. 5, I hope that you not only read fiction, but that you know how to read it. 6, I hope that you can recognize good fiction from bad. 7, I hope that you love words, the sound of them individually and in juxtaposition with one another. 8, I hope that you love hearing stories. 9, I hope that you've grown up in a family which tells stories. 10, I hope that you feel compelled to tell stories yourself. 11, I hope that you are a liar, an exaggerator, a fancifier, a daydreamer, a brooder, a ponderer. 12, I hope that you want to work. 13, I hope that your heart has been broken irreparably at least once. 14, I hope that you will discover your own voices as a writer. And that you discover your own materials, your own obsessions. So, there's a lot of voice there. How did I come up here without a tissue? But, yeah, so that was the, thank you. That was the beginning of a Kent Haruf class, and obviously it's hard for me to read that because you just picture him sitting there, with his arms crossed, and anyway, I don't need to say anything else about it. I would be happy to take any questions. Anyone, please.
Tell us the story about the scene you edited in playing song.
Well, conflict is important. Character conflict setting. And so when Alyssa and I were given this gift of reading plain song and manuscript pages, Victoria went to Maggie's house and was pregnant. And Maggie took her in. But I tell my students, you can't just have conflict, you've got to escalate conflict, right? The story can't end with Victoria at Maggie's house. And Ken asked me, he said, I don't know what to do with her now. I said, shit, man, you ought to have her move in with the McFerrins. Kathy's like, I'm going to kill him. Yeah, that's my new joke. I told that at the Broadmoor, and I thought I would repeat it here. So here's the truth. So I read plain song and manuscript pages, and guess what? Maggie does take Victoria out to the McFerrins. That already happened. That was in there. But there is a scene where the McFerrins are shopping at the grocery store, and Maggie comes in, and they have a conversation. But at that time, the McFerrins are holding up a package of beef, and they're talking about, I told Kent, I said, if they're raising beef cattle, they won't buy their beef at the store. And, what was so cool about Ken is that as wise and as much of a genius as he was also ready to take good ideas from anywhere. And I think this came out in the talk with Peter yesterday too. He was ready to observe, and he was ready to listen to anyone. And so he just said, well, where would they get it? And I said, well, when my dad sells animals, they go to the meat locker, which is right in our town. And he's like, okay, so what happens next? And I said, well, then, 4 days later, they call you and they've got these packages of beef. It's cut the way you want it to be cut, and it's labeled with your name on it. And so he just took notes, and plain song at that time, of course, had been accepted, but the edits were done. So I didn't have anything to do with that Victoria thing, but the McFerrins are now holding pork. think Ken would let me get away with that joke. Any other questions? Got plenty of time. It's not quite 10 yet. I'd like to take another question or two if I could. Putting a lot of pressure on you. I tell my students, okay, you can't leave until I get 3 good questions. Then the hands pop up. Please.
I'm just curious what you're working on now.
I have 2 boys who are 6 and 8. I'm actually on sabbatical, which is a wonderful thing. I'm not teaching this year. And I have 2 boys who are 6 and 8. And I showed Mark a picture yesterday. My older boy is obsessed with snakes. We went to a creek and he's reaching up under these, he saw a snake and it went up under a root ball on a creek bank. And my boy's almost just barely turned 8 years old. And he said, I'm going to have to reach up under there and get that snake out of there. And I'm scared to death of snakes, and my wife's scared to death of snakes. But he did, and he pulled it out, and it bit him on the thumb, and he's bleeding. He's so proud of that. And it's just a common water snake. But my boys are obsessed, really, with outdoors and being outdoors. And I like to think that's in some way because we have pushed them that way. And so I'm trying to write a nonfiction book essentially about them, but also just about introducing kids to nature and screen addiction and things of that nature. So that's what I'm working on. That's my sabbatical project. I'm actually going to have to DePauw that when I go back. Seems like free time off, and it's great, but there's a project in at the end. But writing more nonfiction now than fiction. It's been very hard for me to get back into the kind of headspace that I had when I was writing the novel.
Why?
I don't know. I think in part the house was so much quieter back then. And my life, our lives. I'm sorry. Yeah, I need a coal cellar, but if I had one, they would bang on the door. They would hide under the desk. So it's just become pretty intense, and so in some ways I found it's easier to write about them than it is to get back into that headspace of writing a novel. You've heard that story now several times about the hat and Ken's coal cellar, but there's a lot there for you if you write fiction in terms of the kind of, different writers have different terms for it. Stephen King says it's like taking an elevator down to, some sort of subfloor or basement. But it's this idea that you can have quiet space mentally to go back and live with those characters again and to bring those characters back to life, and you need a steady rhythm and you need some, some silence. And that's, at the moment, that's in short supply, but I don't think we would change our lives. We're very blessed and very happy, but that's part of it. Please, yes, sir.
I've always wondered why someone writes.
Yeah.
What was your answer?
That's a great question. The question is, why would someone write? And Mark said yesterday, he said, it's, I'm going to paraphrase, but he said, it's so damn hard and I hate it. And that's a funny thing to say about something that he in particular is so good at. But Kent also told me, he said, I would rather do anything else. He built a deck on his house and slide up in the mountains, and Kathy can clarify this, but I think Gary Fiskajon helped her. But Kent said, when you're building a deck, you can see from day to day the progress. He said, it's like what you have to do, and you're cutting those boards, and the deck's growing. And he's like, that's progress you can see. When you write, it's such an act of faith, and you can't, even though you're stacking up pages, you can't see for sure that it's all going to come together. And he said, I would so much rather build a deck or do anything really rather than write fiction. On the other hand, that sounds really odd when you hear it, when you think about where we are today and what he was able to accomplish. I don't know if anybody would make Kent famous for building decks. But so the question is, why would you do it? I think Kent would say, and I don't want to, I'll put words in his mouth, but I think he would say, I'm honoring a place and I'm honoring some people who may not have those stories told if I don't tell them. And that's, So in some ways, in some tiny way, I think I try to do that same sort of thing, which is I tell my students, even if it's nonfiction, write the story that few people or no one else can write, you know. And I think in some ways, and Kent probably wouldn't admit this, but I think he would say he would think that's what he's doing, is he would tell the story to the McFerrins because the McFerrins won't tell that story themselves. And it's revealing something about human nature, just as Peter said yesterday.
He told me at one point that if he wasn't writing, he wouldn't know what the hell to do with himself.
And there too, it's funny, I talked more about this 2 years ago, but you know, on one hand, he could have taught. He was just the best teacher, but I think too he would say that writing fueled his teaching, and you know, ultimately became even more productive use of stuff. Please.
Kind of going along with your question of why write, my question is why read, and it comes about this way. I have grandchildren who have been avid readers, but now as they reach high school, they read only assigned things. I'm wondering from your experience, does that continue, or will they go back to reading for their own pleasure?
That's kind of the million-dollar question, I think. It's part of what's going on in this.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, I sure can. I was kind enough to ask, my grandchildren were avid readers. Now that they've reached high school, they only read assigned materials. And she wondered, will they go back to becoming those who read for pleasure in the future? In my experience, maybe at DePauw. Well, I could say, people often ask me, how are students different today than they were 20 years ago? I've actually taught at DePauw 22 years now. And they haven't changed as much as, in my experience, as you might guess. Now, they're certainly more comfortable with their phones in their hands. One small change that's sort of fascinating to me is that as you have a student-written story, the characters will talk to each other. But almost every story I get these days has a scene or scenes of texting, because that's become their dialogue, right? So I stress, you gotta have dialogue, you gotta get these characters talking to each other, and my students hear me, but their answer to that is they're going to text each other, because of course that's how they communicate in real life, right? So there are changes. Now on the other hand, I will say that I think years ago we thought maybe reading would die with the onset of e-readers and things like that, but my students for the most part grew up reading Harry Potter. Those are not short books. They grew up reading a lot of fantasy type stuff many times, but to me what's important is their reading. And so what I tell, if a parent happens to ask me, if he or she can't find anybody else to ask, and they ask me, what can I do to get kids reading? I say, they have to be drawn to that reading themselves. They have to read the material they love. And so our house, for example, is now filled with books about snakes. And my one boy will read a page every night before he goes to bed, and he's just studying these snakes. I think what's important there is he's reading. Now the question though becomes, will they go back to reading after college? And I think, I have to believe the answer is yes. I think book clubs help in many ways. But what I always notice is that you can walk into a bookstore and you can love being in a bookstore if you can find one, but you can also be very intimidated. It's hard to find good writing. And Kent says here, you've got to be able to tell good fiction from bad. When a student leaves college or just leaves high school, there's often not somebody there to say, this is good fiction, this is bad. This is how you separate all that wheat from the chaff. And that, I think, becomes the bigger challenge. But if they can find something they love, then I think many of them do go back to reading. As many as went back to reading 40 or 50 years ago, I couldn't say. Maybe not. But I wish we could do a better job of helping readers find the material that they would love. And I don't have an answer for that, but maybe there's an app for it. Any other questions? Please.
Do you think that people are losing vocabulary, and what kind of things do, what kind of effect will that have?
They're certainly very comfortable with text speak. My students anyway, again, are very comfortable with texting, and texting is obviously different from writing, and we know that. Now, having said that, when I ask my students to complete this assignment or any other assignment I give them, my sense is, and maybe I'm reading too much into this, but my sense is that they are happy to be able to drop the phones and kind of dive deeply into a piece that's, this nonfiction assignment, I usually say, give me, 7 to 10 pages. But that becomes the kind of writing that maybe they're getting away from in their personal lives, which is, very short text or tweet. But their vocabulary, I get some really amazing pieces of writing every semester. And it could be from first-year students, it could be from seniors, and it could be students from the smallest town in Indiana. From last semester, I had a student, a woman from Iran. So I have students from all over, and the talent just shows up, and you never know where it's going to appear, but they seem to enjoy getting into those longer, fuller, more vivid sentences again. You have to give them an assignment, push them to do that, but they can do it, and they will do it. And in those pieces, the vocabulary is as impressive as you might hope for. Now, having said that, again, those characters are texting and they're reacting to their own lives, but they can still write about it in really good ways. But I would take the best piece of writing I got last year and put it up next to the best piece of writing I got 20 years ago. So I think many things are still working with language, even though clearly we have things we're concerned about. Please.
Ken said that I hope you would know the difference between good fiction and bad fiction.
Yeah, right.
You can't ever write bad fiction.
He would tell you, in that videotaped speech yesterday, I wrote those terrible short stories in Turkey and things like that, but by the time I got to know him, which was as he was finishing Plainsong, I didn't see many sentences that I could follow, that's for sure.
Well, what was the question, right?
Oh, I'm sorry, I was supposed to read. This nice young man asked, he said, Kent says, I hope you know the difference between good fiction and bad. And he said, did Kent ever write bad fiction? Well, again, if he did, it was long before I met him. He was a pro at work by the time I knew him, that's for sure. Please.
How do you teach students to learn good versus bad?
How do you teach students to learn good versus bad fiction? And what Kent says in this list is he says, I hope you've read a story by Peter Taylor, Flannery O'Connor, but what I think most good writing teachers do is give them models and say, give them a model and say, this is how one writer has taken on an assignment like this and written a piece that has some successes. And I think you've got to be careful to say, you don't have to do this exact thing, but here's one way to get you thinking about what a good short story might look like, or how somebody might use a third-person limited narrator or a first-person narrator. But if you give them, maybe half a dozen models, they'll usually jump from there. And then you could go back maybe in a workshop and say, well, here's a moment where you might have done what so-and-so did, Dora Welty did here, and having those models in place helps. If you don't give them any models, it's a little bit like asking them to build, a rocket ship or something they haven't seen or been inside. So those models help, but you've got to be careful on how you select those models. Now, again, having said that, I'll give a student Mark's essay in Boy's Work, and they're like, okay, as far as I can tell from this essay, my students will say things like, he's living with the hired hands instead of his parents, and he just shot his horse. They're like, I grew up in a suburb of Indianapolis. What am I supposed to write about now? So there is that risk, But that's when I, as a teacher, have to go in and say, okay, even if you haven't shot a pet or something, you have experiences of value, and how could you write about them in the way Mark wrote about sucks. Please.
Have any of your students continued writing as they grow into adults and on? And if so, have you been able to pass on the mentorship that you got from Kent? And if there have been multiple ones, how do you decide which ones to really devote your time and energy to?
Well, the question is, have any of my students gone on to find literary success and how?
No, I said to write, not necessarily success.
Yeah, right. Good point, good point. There you go. So how have they continued to write, and how do I mentor them, or are there any in particular I continue to mentor? And I would say I worked really hard with my students for 4 years. I'm not averse to social media. I'm on Facebook, and so I'm able to follow them. I've had students go to pretty much every graduate school MFA program in the country. That's not the be-all, end-all, but we've had students go on to find success at MFA programs, and several of my former students are now tenure-track professors at universities. So, and we've had DePauw's had several students publish mostly books of poems over short stories or novels, but they have gone on to do things. And sometimes I'll talk to a former student about marketing or things like that, things I barely know anything about myself. But you know, it's at that point they become what I'm bold enough to say I had with Kent, which is just friends talking about the world of writing, you know. And Mark touched on that so well yesterday, but some of those students who have really stuck with it and really write seriously, it's just fun to commiserate with them and share joys with them. But the mentorship at that point is probably, you know. Please, anything else? Yes?
Greg, it's always such a pleasure having you up there, hearing from you. And
She said she hated everything she's heard so far.
I'll also add, it's great, I have to say, it's so refreshing to see so many men cry. I mean that in the best sense. But I'm curious, from where you're coming from, if there's some thought you have around Kent, around our dad, his level of open-heartedness and kind of maybe an alternative story of masculinity that showed up within himself, maybe within his characters, and how that might resonate with you.
This one will be hard for me to answer. Specifically trying, the question was, will you cry again? I may cry again. The answer is maybe. So, but the truth is, and this came out yesterday, but Kent was teaching us how to live, you know, and how to be humble, and, you know, nobody was crying in his workshops because in part we were having fun, we were intimidated, and he was saying "God damn" to us all the time, and I shared this story 2 years ago, but he flat out leveled one of my good friends who had written these really well-written stories, essentially without conflict. And again, this is a workshop, so everyone had taken that story home, read it, critiqued it. And my friend was just a beautiful writer, and we got back in the classroom, and we were saying good things about the story, but essentially nothing had happened in that story. And Kent had his arms crossed, he was leaning back, and he said, "Ed, God damn it," he said, "if you ever turn in another story like this where nothing bad happens to anyone," he said, "I will not read it. I'm not going to read it." My friend was a very serious student of writing, and to hear that from someone he loved and idolized, it was just crushing. And but it was what Ed needed to hear at that time, and the next story Ed wrote was the best story he'd written, and the characters were doing things that Ed would not have done. And Kent knew that he had to push someone like that, and he knew how to push someone like that. But he had other sides too, and okay, I debated on telling this story. Now I kind of have to, but he, and this is the kind of story I can't share in polite company, can't share with my students, but one time, Kent and I were talking about dreams, and he said, I've had some funny dreams. He said, one time he said, I was laughing so hard, I woke myself up. He said, but in my dream, Mark was here 2 years ago, he said, in my dream, Mark and I were at an aquarium, and these two fish swam by very quickly. And he said, my brother said, in my dream, would you look at that little cocksucker go? He said, I laughed so hard, he said, I woke myself up. So he had a lot of stories like that. And I can't share that kind of story with my students, you know? But when I think about him and I think about other sides of him, I think about us laughing so hard at that. And ever since then, I've wanted to have that dream. It hasn't happened, but I've gone to many aquariums with my boys. They're always in my head. So, well, have I reached the end of my rope wrap? Maybe we'll leave on that note. So I will say this. Kent could write a beautiful sentence, but he wasn't afraid of some ugly language either. So, anyway. Oh, please.
I don't think you answered your question. It was about Mark's position as a man, and his image as a man of himself, and the degree to which he conveyed that, and that.
This idea of Kent as a man and the way he portrayed himself, and what I think Kent would say is that a man can be masculine and be sensitive at the same time. And, you know, I don't want to turn this back around to Mark again, but this is someone who has shot his own horse. I know he's been in some bar fights, and he could knock me out, but he gave me a hug and a kiss on the cheek, you know? So I think that's what Kent lived. And, you know, he was so sensitive. He loved those pets. He loved people, but that didn't diminish his masculinity, I don't think. So he was a model for us, and one that we probably need more now than ever, you know? Is that better? Is that a better answer? Please.
So on that note, when you say that he wrote stories about people that wouldn't tell their own stories like the Fair Brothers.
Yeah.
To me, that's also informing a certain masculine trait or a certain masculine personality. Go.
So the question is, like the McFerrins could not tell their own story, so Kent would tell it. And you said that's a display of a masculine trait, helping someone out in some ways.
No,
Or,
I'm thinking about the closed offness of the McFerrins.
yeah.
I don't know if there's a question here.
But I think you can look very, and again, a literature professor I think could have an excellent paper here. This idea of masculinity and Haruf's writing. And, but you know, when you look at the McFerrins and how they are, in many senses, utterly masculine, right? And he takes pains to paint that. The house has almost no feminine touch to it until Victoria arrives. So they're examples of men who are masculine. On the other hand, they're willing to take Victoria in. To me, one of the best scenes in the book is when they take the boys in after that long ride, and they move those chairs that hadn't been moved in however many years. Just an example of them being willing to change and be less masculine and let that not diminish them. But on the other hand, again, to stick with Plainsong, you know, and again, my boys are 6 and 8, and Ike and Bobby, I think, are 9 and 10. But when Russ and the Murphy kid assault those boys and strip them, and that becomes very much about masculinity. I mean, not only are they physically manhandling those boys, but you'll remember they strip them and then they say something about the boys' privates to Charlene. It's just almost impossible to read. Yeah, I felt that way before I had boys. And when I read that, I thought, this is sounds funny, it's like I understand the difference between fiction writing and nonfiction, but it's like, that's not the Kent I know, but he knew he needed to include those examples of sort of hyper-masculinity, I think, to show what someone like Charlene is dealing with as she negotiates her world. And that's something I think that we see all the time. I tell my students, you know, the biggest thing that's changed, I think, in the world with cell phones is that I say when I was a kid in high school, if I was dating someone, if I was lucky enough to date someone, that night, it's like if I wanted to, I could call her house. At which point, you know, maybe her dad would answer. And I'd have to say, can I talk to, you know, Rhonda? But now, these students, starting at about the age of 16, are in direct 24/7 communication with each other, directly. No parent answering the phone at all. And I always tell my students, and my female students especially agree with me, I say that's led to a very controlling, dangerous environment for young women. And to me, it starts with a very simple text. Where are you? And that's what our young female people are dealing with now. This cell phone that lets them be tracked all the time. And the sense that someone can make them answer at any time. And that's something I think that's, I mean, in some ways that the phone has, in my opinion, increased that sort of masculine control.
Would you call what you just described distorted masculinity rather than extreme masculinity?
He said, would you call that distorted masculinity instead of extreme masculinity? I think to my mind, there's no question it's an unhealthy tip of the balance of power. And again, tipping to, and these guys are my students too, you know, we've got to hopefully try to show them a better way. But a man can exert more control over a woman through her phone, a young woman through her phone, than he otherwise would be able to these days. And there's no question that's a distortion. No question. And again, that's little to do with writing, but it's what I see show up then in the stories. Students will write again, they have these text conversations, but they're not without conflict. And they're just about that. They're about controlling something. You've been a wonderful audience. I thank you all so much for listening to me.